very much for being with us. We've heard a lot in the past few hours, I would say, at least here in Washington. Uh, Help us understand, how did the situation get to this point where Turkey is in a situation where it's asking for help, and asking for help from the U.S., where it just recently was in a high tension with the U.S. over Syria.
It can be summarized as the Turkish-Russia deal in Idlib over the Turkish military presence there, alongside the military presence of the Syrian regime, has collapsed. And that is the most natural outcome. When a deal collapses, skirmishes start to occur. I think one needs to look at how Turkey overplayed its hand in Syria, and lately also in Libya, against another Russian ally. And the reason for this, in my opinion, was the Turkish inability to comprehend the Russian agenda in Syria, and the reasons that Russia came to this country in 2016. The Russian military presence and operations in Syria are dedicated for a single cause. That is the protection and the eventual success of the Syrian regime against all non-state actors, but particularly those who are aligned with Turkey in Idlib and elsewhere in northwestern Syria. The case of Idlib, that at one point would have fallen under the Syrian regime's rule, was anticipated, but in my understanding, the Ankara government was unable to comprehend the nature of the Russian presence and the agenda of the Russian presence in Syria, and miscalculated that its relations with Moscow, the fostering diplomatic alliance that the two countries have been enjoying since over the past few years, could have helped Turkey to shape the Russian agenda in this country as well. And apparently it also failed. That didn't happen. Yesterday was very significant, as according to open sources, over 30 Turkish soldiers were killed in airstrikes. Turkey claims those airstrikes were conducted by the Syrian regime and never mentions Russia, but even Russian sources acknowledge that.
Well, so see, that's a very, very interesting point, where Russia basically says, I was the one carrying out these airstrikes, and Turkey says, no, it was the Syrian regime. Does that indicate some sort of retaliation plan that Turkey has for Syria?
Actually, no. It indicates that Turkey doesn't want Russia's enmity at this point. It's a very delicate time. It's very sensitive, especially after the Turkish government lost the U.S. support in the Middle East, which will take so much time for them to repair. It's just not a good time to make Russia a complete enemy. That's why, in my opinion, Turkey refrains from announcing Russia as the perpetrator. But yesterday, there were videos published by Turkish-backed groups, clearly showing that Turkish soldiers are engaged with the use of manpads against Russian fighter jets. So I think it's clear to everyone, but the Turkish population itself, that the airstrikes were perpetrated by Russia, and it will take time for Turkey to acknowledge that this was yet another crisis with the Russian government in Syria.
So the interesting part, though, is that Turkey is trying to invoke the collective security kind of benefits that it has with NATO. And wouldn't it be a lot easier if Turkey would say, yes, it was Russia, and we know NATO was created to kind of counter the Soviet Union and the Russian kind of, forces in the region. How does that kind of square out for Turkey when they're trying to say it's not Russia, but NATO needs to help when it comes to this situation with our troops in Syria?
That's a very smart question. Um, this would have been the case hadn't Turkey's relations with the US and NATO worsened as well. So it is a delicate calculation for Turkey. It can't rely on potential US or NATO support, particularly after the, the crises Turkey and the US had over the purchase of S-400 missile systems from Russia, and other crises like the administrative detentions of US nationals, the removal of Turkey from the F-35 program, and the disputes that Turkey and NATO have at the moment, mostly because of the inability of to interoperate the weapon systems that Turkey and NATO use in their drills and operations. It's understandable that that Turkey doesn't want to play all of its cards on NATO and the US at the moment, so trying to receive support from both sides, the US and the NATO, in an area that is not influenced by the US, by the way. Northwestern Syria is under Russian influence, and the airspace is controlled by Russia. So the US influence will be very much limited. But in the meantime, I think they're leaving the door open for further negotiations with Russia, and refraining from announcing Russia as the perpetrator is, I think, the best indicator we have that Turkey has its door open for Moscow.
So in the conversation today between Putin and Erdogan, there are reports that Erdogan has informed Putin that the Syrian regime targets are legitimate targets for Turkey, for Turkish forces from now on. Do you see a full-scale war between Turkey and Syria, and then by extension Russia is involved in that too? But do you see that Turkey would actually start invading Syria, even like the Syrian regime, and attacking Syrian regime forces in full scale?
Well, once there are bullets being fired, there's always a risk of a full-scale war between two states. But in this case, it's not only two states engaging with each other, it's also the involvement of regional and global superpowers, the US and Russia. As I mentioned, the airspace in northwestern Syria is controlled by Russia, single-handedly. So the Turkish aerial operations in Syria have always remained dependent on the approvals by either the US or Russia. In the Afrin operation, northeastern Aleppo operations that Turkey conducted since 2016 were all approved by Russia, and Turkish fighter jets were flying as long as the Russian military allowed them to use the airspace. The same thing happened since October 2019, as Turkey invaded northeastern Syria against the Kurdish groups. The airspace was used courtesy of U.S. turning a blind eye, because the airspace in that area is controlled by the U.S. So once you can't fly, it means whatever the scale of the war will be, it will be limited to an area where you have logistics and supplies. That means if Turkey and Syria engage in a bigger warfare, the objectives will be much limited, and potentially for Turkey, potentially to regain control over strategic positions that it lost in the past 2 weeks. But an invasion of additional territory is actually technically impossible unless Turkey wants to the enmity of Russia as well. Very recently, I think today, in a few hours, Russia has been deploying warships to Eastern Mediterranean that are capable of hitting Turkish targets, not only in northwestern Syria, but also inside Turkey. Turkish jets are unable to fly over Idlib since yesterday. So it's fair to say the Syrian regime has got a fair backing a strong backing from Moscow that Turkey lacks at the moment. And if Turkey wants to continue to operate in northwestern Syria, be it Idlib or Aleppo, it requires the relations with Russia, which also explains to us why Turkey is leaving the door open for negotiations with Russia, because it knows a Russian discontent will mean the eventual withdrawal of Turkish forces from Idlib and the collapse of the entire plan. It goes back to the first point we made. Turkey misunderstands Russia's agenda in Syria. The main Russian ally is the Syrian regime. I don't say Assad per se, is the Syrian government, whoever leads it. This is the reason that Russia made the deployments. It will not allow the regime to fall. And the Turkish government has been misunderstanding this agenda as if the Russian presence in Syria also serves Russia's relations with Turkey. Russia sees these things two different arenas. It has relations with Turkey. It sells weapons to Turkey. It's ready to help Turkey to achieve nuclear facilities. It's ready to help Turkey achieve non-NATO standard weapon systems. Anything else, Russia is particularly happy to have Turkey on its side against the U.S. and the U.S.-led camp, but this is only one side of the story. It does not change the Russian agenda in Syria, and we're seeing a demonstration of it.
So, U.S. In this case, U.S. has been critical towards the Russian kind of support for the Syrian regime, of Syrian attacks in Idlib, even speaking out in support of the Turkish troops or Turkish forces there in Syria. And Turkey has been calling, and there's been some diplomatic traffic between Turkey, between Ankara and Washington. Turkey is calling for U.S. support in this case. Since we're in the Washington perspective program, let's also talk about the U.S.'s kind of approach to this recent development. This is not just developments that we've seen in the past. There's like a little bit of aggression. Now Turkish soldiers are getting killed. Now there are airstrikes. Now it's a lot more serious, if you would say, in terms of like how the politicians in Washington, Ankara are thinking. Like when people get killed, it's serious, but when soldiers get killed, then politicians start to take it a lot more serious. So, how do you see Washington's kind of approach to the issue here? Because Washington is not really, it's kind of angry at Turkey, but at the same time.
I mean, Turkey is a strong regional country.
Right.
For many aspects. It may not have the strongest military in the region when it's compared to Russia or Israel or the U.S., but it's a strong economic actor. It's a strong geopolitical actor with its territories extending from Europe to into Asia Minor. It's an important country, so nobody wants to lose Turkey, right? And the U.S. never intended to lose Turkey to Russia, and on the U.S. perspective, this was always a minus on the U.S. side. Losing it, any ally to, let's say, your opponent or adversary, I'm not going to use the word enemy, but to the other side. Having a NATO ally purchase weapon systems that cannot interoperate with your weapon systems. Having a NATO and a U.S. ally be in Moscow every month and lay out plans, strategic plans for Syria and even to Libya in cooperation with Russia and not with the U.S. was a minus, was a loss on the U.S. side. It has always been considered like this. So critics of losing Turkey in Washington and those who will want to have Turkey change its course of action, at least partially, towards the U.S., will definitely look at this situation in Idlib as an opportunity to send out more positive messages to Ankara, send support messages to Ankara, try to repair at least some of those worsened relations, which, I mean, if you want to talk, it's a long process. Reversing this is not only a rhetorical issue. Reversing this is not only who supports who. Reversing this is also a technical thing, and may even lead to the Turkish withdrawal from Syria, from northwestern Syria, if Turkey wants to repair these relations with the U.S. Because better relations with the U.S. will mean worsened relations with Russia. Worsened relations with Russia will mean Turkish withdrawal from northwestern Syria.
But it doesn't include northeastern Syria in this
No,
case.
it's still a U.S. Still a U.S. influenced area.
But Turkey was in northeast, despite U.S.'s kind of, the U.S. didn't want Turkey to
No,
begin
Turkey,
with.
the U.S. just gave the green light. That's no question.
U.S. did give the green light at the very last resort, like they couldn't stop Turkey. Then, so if
I mean, the same can be applied to northwestern Syria. Will the U.S. The U.S. did not even want to engage or have any military tensions with Turkey when Turkey wanted to invade northeastern Syria. Would the U.S., as going back to your first question, would the U.S. come back to northwestern Syria and impose military sanctions and measures against Russia to protect Turkey? That's just not logical. What Turkey wants from the U.S., I find it very hard to believe, to be honest. But it's speculated that the Turkish government wants a no-fly zone over Idlib imposed by the U.S., which means an effective interception of Russian fighter jets, where Russia has the biggest military bases like Khmeimim and Latakia, where the Russian deployment to Syria actually started from this region. Expecting this from the U.S. is not logical.
And especially no-fly zone doesn't mean that the U.S. just says, okay, no one can fly there, but that means U.S.
Imposing
actually
it.
flying
Exactly.
fighter jets in the region,
intercept, yeah.
something that Donald Trump is not very fond of.
Yeah.
That includes spending money, that includes sending soldiers or airmen, whatever you call those people who are enforcing the no-fly zone. So you don't see that as a possibility that
It's
US
not
would do.
only the expenditures. It's the U.S. needs stable relations with Russia too. I mean,
Right.
And it's not the time, it's not the occasion that you go into this kind of a.
The
Cold
reason
War
I'm
with-
mentioning the expenditure in the White House now, in Trump's White House, expenditure or the money that costs comes first before anything else, right?
Yeah, definitely it costs money. War costs money. But assume, like, if Turkey gets a promise tomorrow to receive the Patriot missile systems, it's not going to be delivered overnight. It'll take years, right? If Turkey decides to return the S-400 missile systems, it's not going to happen overnight. It will take years, and it will require assurances that no Russian equipment will stay in Turkey. If Turkey decides to withdraw from northwestern Syria, it will take days, or if not weeks. Right? If Russia wants to push out Turkey from there, then it will take again days. So everything requires a prolonged time to happen in this region and in this equation at the moment. And the only actor that lacks time is Turkey.
Right. So a few more questions. I'm afraid if we run out of time before I get to those questions. The burning one is the refugee card that Turkey has always threatened the Europeans with, to the extent of some people calling it like blackmailing the European Union. Now Turkey has opened the gate for the refugees. First, let me ask was it a little premature use of that card? And is it what I see that the refugees being as pawns used by Turkey, and then the European Union or European countries paying Turkey so just to hold them, it just looks like a very nasty game of the use of people in this case. I would rather say both sides. So now that the gates are open, do you think this is the time where Europe can just come to the realization like, okay, this card would have been used against us one time or another, and now it's time to deal with it?
Well, unfortunately, the card doesn't end there, and they're using it today. It doesn't mean that they're running out of this card. There are more refugees in Syria. There are more refugees
And I heard
everywhere.
some unconfirmed reports that they were open only for 72 hours. So they would open the borders to 72 hours. It's just like telling Europe, like, okay, here's a taste of what we might be able to.
Yeah, it's definitely a very cheap game, and everybody accepts this. Even with this term, I'm not inventing the term. It's called by many analysts that it's very cheap to do this, because it's playing with people's lives, playing with the lives of the refugees, and of course it plays with. I mean, just given that we have the potential pandemic of coronavirus now, for instance, it's playing with, it's risking the lives of many people. But one should also ask, why is this happening? Okay, Turkey had a deal with Russia in Syria, in Iran, in Idlib. It had its observation posts and military deployments in northwestern Syria, and it collapsed. So how is Europe related to this? And Turkey, as a countermeasure, as a retaliation, it declared that it will allow refugees to flow into Europe through Turkey. Is that Turkey wants its own crisis to become an international case, and decrease the burden that it has been exposed to in northwestern Syria by bringing in more actors, by risking those actors to become actors in the Idlib scene. I think, as you mentioned, Turkey would have used this card now or later. It is, I think, it would be much better for Europe to develop counter strategies and how to stop these such further refugee flows led by Turkey to stay safe. Can European pressure on NATO do something? No.
So that's the question, though. To someone that is looking at the issue from outside, Turkey is opening the borders or letting the flow of refugees as a way to pressure the Europeans, saying, okay, Idlib situation is not only my problem because it will create more refugees, and here's a sample of them. In a way, that's what Turkey is trying to say. Is that that's what I would say non-experts like us would probably understand. Is that the same view that you would share that same view?
Well, let's go to practical measures that need to be taken in northwestern Idlib to reinforce the Turkish project, Turkish strategy. As we mentioned, it requires a no-fly zone. A no-fly zone requires imposing it. It's just not only a declaration, it's actually a deployment itself. It requires repairing the relations between NATO and Turkey, between Turkey and the US, where there are a lot of crises that have to be put aside or ignored. So with all these intertwined crises and chaotic problems that Turkey has with Europe and the US, and of course NATO, no pressure on Europe can actually change this side of the story. But Turkey might also be calculating that pressure on Europe may also result in pressure on Russia, and by pressuring Europe with the threat of refugees, European nations may resort to pressuring Russia to ease the regulations that they are using against Turkey, and militarily, I mean, in northwestern Syria. But this is also a long shot. So at this point, one can only say the refugee case is just making the Idlib situation an international issue, and to incorporate more actors. But practically, it's unlikely that Turkey will gain anything from this.
Let me ask one last question because we're running out of our time here, but the domestic kind of understanding of the issue, because there were some very small protests against the Russian embassy, I believe in Istanbul or Ankara, either one of them, but that protest was not as big as a protest that if the government wanted, that would have been a lot bigger. So it was clear that the government didn't want that protest to be a big protest in front of the Russian embassy. In the past, there has been some critical kind of voices within Turkey towards the Erdogan's government, like what we are doing in Syria. We don't have good economy here. You know, some of that critical voices towards Erdogan. But at the same time, there are also a lot of praise coming from the Turkish people to the government, saying opening the flow of refugees to Europe was the right decision. Now it's their problem. So help us understand also the dynamics within the Turkish domestic kind of understanding towards the issue. Now soldiers are getting killed. There's the refugees. There's the Russian-U.S. relations, all that.
Well, the Turkish government, the AKP, Erdogan's ruling party, has been particularly successful in consolidating main opposition and pro-government groups when soldiers are killed, when Turkey is dragged into, or Turkey enters into a confrontation. The best example was the Turkish invasion of northeastern Syria in October. Every single opposition group supported this initiative, even though those who were voicing that, the criticisms that you mentioned, what do we do in Syria, were actually in support of the Turkish invasion against the Kurds in northeastern Syria, for the sole reason that it corresponded to a so-called national security threat that Turkey was dealing with, even though there was not a single bullet fired from northeastern Syria into Turkey. So the government is successful in portraying all its endeavors, adventures in Syria, in Libya, anywhere else, as one, as a national security initiative, which is not going to satisfy everyone, but a large chunk of the society. Second is the ideological, the neo-Ottomanist discourse that many like to hear about this, and it's not only the Islamists, by the way. So many nationalist groups in Turkey still envy the Ottoman past and the Turkish influence across the region. So this neo-Ottomanist active Turkey on every front across the globe is something that the majority of Turkish nationalists and Islamists agree on. And then you have the the romanticized side of the story, the shaheed, the martyrs, fallen soldiers, which will eventually and inevitably bring everybody together, except probably the pro-Kurdish parties, who will be critical of the policy but will not be outspoken. But the majority of the Turkish parties and groups will come together and act as a consolidated front on this. So the Turkish government has all the domestic tools to consolidate a voice that supports the Turkish presence and involvement in Syria, especially when soldiers are killed, especially when Turkey is attacked. But apparently, as you mentioned, if we don't see big demonstrations in Turkey against Russia, if we don't see critical and highly critical comments from the Turkish government, it means Turkey's hopes regarding another reconciliation with Russia is still there. Turkey is paying off for being too much dependent on Russia. And it's time for Russia to make Turkey pay off for it.